Peter Mandelson, one of New Labour's architects, elected Hartlepool, 1997, 27,000 votes. In a now infamous conversation with a fellow MP, told them not to worry about losing Labour's working class voters because they had nowhere else to go. Well, in the recent election in Hartlepool, Labour's working class voters have found somewhere else to go. There's no point in beating around the bush. This defeat in Hartlepool is a cataclysmic defeat for the Labour Party. This is one of Labour's heartland seats. There's no point in denying that. The leadership are trying to say that it's not really that important. A lot of commentators across the media are saying, well, it's very predictable that this was going to happen. If the Brexit Party hadn't stood in 2019, it already would have fallen to the Conservatives or, to the Brexit Party themselves, perhaps. That you shouldn't really be too concerned about this. This is a seat that has been Labour, in Labour hands, for 57 years. It's returned a Labour Member of Parliament for all of that time. Its people have gone out and voted Labour in all of those elections. For them to go out in this by-election and turn around and reject the Labour Party after 11 consecutive years of Conservative government, there should be alarm bells ringing in the Labour leader's office. Peter Mandelson has taken to the airwaves today to blame what he's called the two C's, COVID and Corbyn. So let's take them apart. On COVID, we're being told that the vaccine bounce is the reason that the Prime Minister Boris Johnson is so popular and the reason that the Conservative Party are doing so well. But that doesn't explain why the Green Party and why the Liberal Democrats have taken council seats from the Labour Party in the northeast of England as well. Because if we're to believe that, that suggests that opposition parties such as the Greens and the Lib Dems are benefiting from the government's vaccine bounce, but the Labour Party isn't. Now, that's just completely delusional and doesn't make any sense whatsoever. But God forbid me to say that Peter Mandelson is living in an alternative reality. And then the other C, Corbyn. Jeremy Corbyn held Hartlepool in 2017 and 2019. Yes, in 2019, the vote share was reduced, but Labour still won the seat. Now, they all want to talk about 2019 and what happened in that election. And yes, Labour lost the election. You'll find few people on the left who don't accept that the defeat in 2019 was a disaster for the Labour Party and for the cause of socialism in Britain. We all felt that loss. But they all very quickly skirt over what happened in 2017, where Labour won over 50% of the vote in Hartlepool, where Labour started to reconnect with some of these working class communities, these left behind communities that ended up turning their backs on New Labour and people like Tony Blair and Peter Mandelson, who had neglected these communities for so long. And nobody wants to talk about that. 2017 is brushed under the carpet as an aberration, as part of history that nobody wants to discuss. But actually, when you look back at Labour's electoral history, the general election in 2017 is the first election since 1997 that Labour has won more seats than the election before. But it's treated with a sort of pariah status that everybody wants to ignore, that the right of the Labour Party want to pretend never happened. And the left needs to reclaim what happened in 2017 as a moment where Labour's terminal decline was momentarily reversed, where for a brief moment it looked like Jeremy Corbyn and the radical agenda that was offered by the Labour Party actually reversed Labour's fortunes in the country. We also shouldn't forget that heading into the 2017 election, pundits and commentators were very keen to tell us, and constantly tell us, that the Labour Party were 20 points behind in the polls. And of course, a lot of this was down to the fact that Jeremy Corbyn was facing constant attacks, not just from the Tories, not just from the mainstream press, but also from people on his own side, from the Parliamentary Labour Party, from people within his own shadow cabinet, constantly attacking him and sniping him from the sidelines and wanting to have a go at their own democratically elected leader. So actually, we should be looking at 2017 as a moment not just in Hartlepool, but across the country, as a moment where Labour reversed a significant and historic trend of Labour decline across the country. And only 8 months earlier, Corbyn had faced a leadership challenge from within his own ranks. Busy trying to relive the 90s, the team around Keir Starmer thought that it would be a brilliant idea to wheel out Peter Mandelson around Hartlepool and actually posted an official campaign video with him walking around the streets of the town at the same time that they were running a national campaign against Boris Johnson on the issue of sleaze. This man, Peter Mandelson, is kind of like an icon for sleaze under the new Labour government. It was just incredible to see this almost like clown car operation from the people who posed as the professionals, the sort of grown-ups who said that they were back in charge of the Labour Party. There is a bit of an irony to the Starmerites, if you like, and those on the right of the party attacking socialists and suggesting that we're to blame in some ways for these results across the country. They're suggesting that obviously we wanted these results, that we wanted Labour to do badly, which is very ironic given that it is Starmer and those within his camp who have spent the last year of his leadership waging a war on the left of the party rather than taking the fight to the Tories and the Tory government, who have literally got away with murder. We shouldn't forget that 150,000 people have died over the course of this pandemic. And while Labour have been talking about Boris Johnson's wallpaper and how he's decorated the flat at 10 Downing Street, we haven't held the government to account on the late lockdowns, on the decision to open up last summer far too early that led to another lockdown and the repeats of Groundhog Day all over again that have meant we've had the worst of both worlds in terms of lockdowns and deaths and economic damage and continued damage to people's mental health. We've had the worst of all worlds, and we haven't been an effective opposition in holding the government to account on those issues. And Labour have got to own up to that. Keir Starmer and his camp have spent far too much time waging war on the left rather than the Tories. So I'm afraid that there is an irony to them now turning their fire on socialists within the Labour Party and suggesting that we haven't done enough when we've kind of been their focus over the course of the last year, which of course has culminated in the suspension of Jeremy Corbyn, the former leader of the party, which still hasn't been resolved to this day. We've obviously seen Jeremy even apologise for something that he has been asked to apologise for by the party. He's been cleared by the national executive of the party. He's had his membership of the party restored, but hasn't had his membership of the Parliamentary Labour Party restored. So all of these issues remain hanging over the party, and you have this sort of war continuing, this forever factional war continuing within Labour that Starmer and those around him don't want to see brought to an end. And for as long as that continues, the sort of promises that were made around Starmer's leadership campaign of uniting the party, of bringing people together, of Starmer almost being this Harold Wilson figure, are going to continue to ring hollow. While Keir Starmer's busy spending his time telling everybody that he isn't Jeremy Corbyn and not setting out who he is, the Conservative Party are selling a vision to the country and to working class communities such as those in Hartlepool and in the North and the Midlands of a party that wants to see investment pumped into those communities. And we've seen that in the course of these election results, that a lot of people have looked at both of the parties and decided that they'll opt for the person who's offering them something. So if you look at what's happened in Hartlepool, you only need to look at the media reports to see why working class people have opted for the Conservatives. And as a Labour supporter, a Labour member, that's very hard to take. But if you look at what was happening in the campaign, you had Keir Starmer turning up to a pub in a full suit at 11 o'clock in the morning to pose with a pint. And that seemed to be the entirety of Labour's campaign. You had the videos of the Labour Party candidate not being able to tell you what Labour's vision was in the constituency. And I found it very condescending. The idea that, you know, working class people are down the pub all the time at 11 o'clock in the morning. Actually, working class people are at work at 11 o'clock in the morning, often on 0 hours contracts or labouring away hard at work, trying to provide for their families. It's not something where you're sat in the pub all the time, and you're certainly not sat in the pub in a full suit. So why would working class people opt for that over Boris Johnson turning up into the constituency? And he might be telling a pack of lies when he talks up about the levelling up agenda. I don't deny that for a second, and we know that the Tories are barefaced liars who will say whatever they need to say to get elected and to take power, to keep power for their mates, to do what they need to do to maintain their power and wealth for a privileged few. But their message is stronger for people. If you go into communities and you promise that you're going to do things for them, if you promise that you're going to invest in the local hospital, in local services, and then people are naturally going to vote for that over somebody who turns up and decides to pose for photo shoots. And that's something that I think we've seen happen in Hartlepool. And I've got to be honest, as somebody who was born into and sort of brought up in the Labour movement, it's absolutely heartbreaking to see. And, you know, people can sort of snipe from the sidelines and say that socialists were happy to see these results, happy to see Labour lose in places like Hartlepool. I was absolutely devastated to see Labour lose in Hartlepool, devastated to see places like Sunderland lose councillors, to hear talk of Durham falling almost entirely to the Conservative Party. That's heartbreaking, because that's, you know, that's part of my heritage. It's part of a lot of people's heritage. So to be told that, you know, we're sort of gleeful about the fact that we're losing these places, that hurts, actually. So the reason I think that people like myself make these criticisms, and it's difficult criticism to make actually against your own party. Very difficult for us to make these criticisms when Jeremy was leader, because you believe in the project, you believe passionately in your politics, and it's hard to criticise your own side. But you've got to do it, because if you don't, you let things die, you let things wither on the vine. So you've got to stand up at times and say if something's wrong. And at the moment, if people don't stand up and say that what is happening in the Labour Party is wrong, there won't be a Labour Party. And the Tories have even adopted Corbyn and McDonnell's language. They're talking about the Green Industrial Revolution. They're talking about northern investment banks. They're talking about moving the Treasury to the north of England. They've taken elements of those manifestos. John McDonnell speaks very eloquently about what the Tories are doing. They're not daft. They know what they're doing. While Keir and elements of the Labour Party are busy purging the party of anything and everything to do with Jeremy Corbyn and everything to do with John McDonnell, the Conservative Party are trying to steal elements of their agenda and selling it to people who are then going out and voting for it in their droves. While we know that at the moment Labour has no real vision or strategy under Keir Starmer, we have to be honest about the fact that this problem goes back much further than just Keir Starmer. So when Labour lost the Copeland by-election, I didn't call for Jeremy Corbyn to resign. And after this by-election loss in Hartlepool, I don't think it's right necessarily to call for Keir Starmer to resign. But that's my personal call. I think it's up to Labour members within a Democratic Party to make their own decisions. But the reason I say that is because I think that the strategy and the direction is so much more important. Keir Starmer has had his chance now. His strategy has been proven to be an absolute disaster. The sort of false flag waving that's got absolutely no meaning behind it, the condescending posing with a pint, all of that sort of falseness and posing has to go out of the window now because it hasn't worked. So he's had his opportunity with that strategy and it hasn't worked. So he's got to change. But we can't kid ourselves about how deep-rooted this problem is. And we've seen it happen across Europe with the sort of traditional Labour parties that have died and have withered away. I believe that Labour is in a period now of terminal decline, and it has been for a long time, if we're honest about it. And as we discussed earlier, that 2017 election was an aberration. It was a moment where that sort of trend was reversed for a brief moment. And we need to learn the lessons of that, but we also need to look broadly at the trends that are underpinning Labour's current defeats. And we've got to learn the lessons of why Labour is losing in these post-industrial areas. And we can't go down the sort of race-baiting, anti-immigrant rhetoric that some would suppose, because this idea that white working class people are automatically racist bigots who sort of like voted Brexit out of an immediate desire to sort of turn away immigrants is just simply wrong, in my view. I think that a lot of people voted Brexit as a middle finger to the establishment and to Westminster. And actually, a lot of the anti-Labour vote that's happening at the moment is a similar sort of protest vote too. If the Labour Party stops taking the piss out of working class people, then maybe, just maybe, working class people will stop taking the piss out of the Labour Party. And that means the working class in its entire diversity. It's working class voters in Scotland who have rejected the party. Yes, it's working class voters in Hartlepool, the North East, the Midlands, who have done the same. But it's also young working class people who are working precarious jobs in the cities, who are starting to think that maybe the Labour Party isn't for them. That if the Labour Party is saying, we're not so interested in representing you, that actually they're not going to bother going out and voting for Labour. And if Labour ends up in that position where it's losing voters from across its entire coalition, then it's doomed to failure. Because we've seen a similar thing happen in Hartlepool. Yes, the almost entirety of the Brexit Party support went to the Tories, but Labour's own vote share fell back from the last election, which means that some of Labour's own voters went to the Conservatives. And if we start to see that trend repeated, not just in Hartlepool, and not just in some of the so-called Red Wall seats, but in the cities, then Labour's in real trouble. There is absolutely nothing to celebrate off the back of these election results. A Tory party cementing itself in working class communities to further solidify its support for the incredibly powerful and the incredibly wealthy eventually serves nobody but themselves, and they will exploit this support for themselves, and we should be under no illusions about that. But I do strongly believe that we can't just shout at people who have voted Tory in these communities. We can't call them thick, or as I've seen online, people suggesting that they're knuckle draggers, or simply turn our backs on them and just say we're going to go after city voters now and that's it. We're not going to bother with the sort of typical industrial areas that Labour once supported. We've got to build a broad coalition of support from across the country, uniting the working class in all its diversity. And if the Labour Party is able to fulfil that historic task, then we'll be truly victorious. If you think that things are bad now, they can also get a lot worse. At the moment, Johnson is sort of pretending to be the father of the nation figure. He's doing the sort of one nation Tory approach, but as we've seen just over the short time that he's been Prime Minister, he can change at any moment. The Tories are very good at adapting to suit the times. We've seen him go from being the sort of the Prime Minister who was ill in hospital, who needed the nation to rally around, to the suggestions that he made, the hideous comments, that let the bodies pile high in their thousands, horrific comments about all of the thousands of people who have been lost to COVID. So we know that they will shift and change to adapt to the circumstances of the time. And what's worrying is that they may exploit circumstances across the country. And with a sort of subservient media on the side, and with new media organisations rising at the moment, or about to rise on the right, it's an incredibly worrying time in the country in terms of what might come out of the sewer, if you like, at a time when people's vulnerabilities are being exploited. It's always important amid all the dystopia to find the scraps of utopia, of hope, amid the rubble, if you like. We've got to always remember that there are more of us than there are of them. And often that sounds very poetic and quite distant and not very material, but it is true. And there are an incredibly powerful group of people, but they are few. And obviously that was the core message of Labour's sort of historic campaign in 2017. And we do need to revisit that and refine and renew that energy of that campaign. And I believe that in doing so, in rerouting ourselves in communities, in linking up with our trade unions, in finding solidarity again with people, we're able to reassert a new agenda across the country for hope, for solidarity, for changing the way that things are, for people's material conditions, but also for offering a bit more than that, for going a bit further, and for tackling real, genuine inequality in the country. The times that we are in require serious, radical change. Tinkering around the edges just isn't going to cut it. The inequality crisis that we face across the globe is unprecedented. Wealth inequality at this moment in time is off the scale. If we look at the COVID crisis, the current debate around vaccines is something that I think we shouldn't even be having the debate about making sure that the patents are dropped and that people are vaccinated. Just look at the response of the market to the idea that Joe Biden had of releasing the patents and making sure that people across the world, some of the poorest people across the world, will be vaccinated and millions of lives saved, to see how bonkers the current state of the world is, how crazy capitalism has got in the modern world. And you can extend that out. Look at the compounding crises of capitalism, not just in the economy, but across all different sectors of our world, into the climate, into the world of work, into people's personal lives, the effect that all of these compounding crises are having on people's mental health. We need to get serious about the problems that we face, and that's why it's so incredibly important that here in the UK, socialists come together to make sure that the Labour Party is a serious outfit that's fighting for change alongside the trade unions and working people to demand radical alternatives to the current state of play in this country.